An old story can reasonably be gained on old stones. These flags were laid here by Irish contract laborers 118 years ago in the year our Lord 1845, and the administration of James K. Polk, who was a Democrat. Maybe 118 years isn't really old, not by the standards of Boston, Philadelphia, or Richmond, but for the Midwest it's old. And here, history belongs to the Midwest at a time when this, not Boston, Philadelphia, or Richmond, was stage center, the eye of the hurricane. Some of the sheen was ground into these stones by the boot heels of men whose names were famous, or became famous. Henry Clay, Robert E. Lee, Bennett Champ Clark, Fremont, Ulysses S. Grant, and William Sherman. But the name that's most remembered here was less than a real name to begin with, being only a nickname, a stable-yard joke fastened in ridicule on a simple childlike nonentity of a man who started out in this world as Sam Blow. Poor Sam Blow, well into middle age and dying of tuberculosis, monumentally ignorant, more than a little pompous, hugely enjoying all the fuss he was stirring up without understanding even 100th part of what it was all about. Whoever he was, he stood here, crossed and recrossed his stone floor, trailed a dutiful 5 steps behind his betters as they hurried from cloakroom, the clerk's office, to courtroom, to the gentleman's bar in Barnum's Hotel across the street. He was a nobody, with an easy-to-say 2-word name that fate had chosen to shoot up like a Roman candle, high over the stone floor into the patented cast-iron dome where Mr. Weimer painted justice and other allegorical figures. Poor, simple-minded Sam Blow. 2.5 million humans were in bondage like the children of Israel. And fate had picked him, this innocent, utterly incongruous, simple-minded child of nature, to be a beacon that would help light the way up out of this darkness. Jacob led the children of Israel into Egypt, where they stayed, were betrayed, and became the slaves of Pharaoh. Nobody led the children of Africa into slavery. They were flogged into it, herded into it, transported into it, and eventually born into it, which is how it started for poor Sam Blow. Sam was born the slave of a Virginia planter named Peter Blow, by all accounts, a kindly man, but one who, like Jacob, had to lead his people out of a land of famine. So Peter led his people out of 6 years of tobacco crop failure in Virginia to Alabama, where he failed once again, then to Missouri, where he quit farming for good and went into the boarding house business. In all, there were 13 of them: Peter, his wife, 7 children, and at least 4 slaves, 2 of whom were so old they were only fit to peel vegetables in the backyard behind the kitchen. But help they did, and the best they could, until Peter Blow, the master, died. Then the slaves were sold, the 2 that could be sold, to help liquidate the estate. And Sam Blow became the property of a military man, an army doctor named Emerson, stationed at the old St. Louis Jefferson Barracks. Alexander the Great was 4 years old when he first reviewed his father's troops. Napoleon Bonaparte was 15 when he became an artillery cadet. And Sam Blow was nearly 39 when he first saw the soldiers drilling on the barracks parade ground. But it was a moment of destiny, even though it found Sam a little late. The drums rattled and the bugles blared and the bayonets flashed in the sun. And Sam Blow's soul knew exultation as he clapped his hands and cried out laughing, "Oh my, ain't that something? Oh my, ain't that grand?"
Down Golden Street will be a walking and singing as we go, for soon the great day will be coming in the year of Jubilee. Then you will hear the trumpets blowing for the final judgment day. The kingdom soon will be a coming and it can't be far away. No more the work of sleepy sleep, oh, it must be now the kingdom coming in the year of Jubilee. And when the angels are up, in the horse and they will go, and we'll all sing and be so happy in the year of Jubilee. Oh, if the kingdom comes tomorrow, we'll all be gay and free, for only good times will be now in the year of Jubilee. No more the rock, oh, it must be now the kingdom coming in the year of Jubilee. No more the rock, oh, it must be now the kingdom coming in the year of Jubilee.
Sam Blow became the property of a military man, an army surgeon named Dr. Emerson. And that is how, in the tradition of other historic figures like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon, it happened Sam took up a military career. Not that he was a soldier exactly. What he was a slave and a valet who shaved his master's face, washed his underwear, and emptied his chamber pot every morning. But Sam Blow liked army life. He liked band music. He liked parades. And above all, he liked uniforms. So much that he lovingly made his own out of discarded bits of fine cloth, leather strapping, and an old cavalry hat with plumes. That year, Dr. Emerson was posted out of Jefferson Barracks to Fort Armstrong, upriver near Rock Island, Illinois. And it was here, dressed in his uniform and strutting and drilling for the entertainment of the private soldiers, that Sam came to earn his immortal nickname. Great Scott, they called him after old spit and polished Winfield Scott, commanding general of the United States Army. And Sam took to calling himself Great Scott, only he pronounced it with his Gullah accent, Dred Scott. Dr. Emerson humored this harmless little conceit. Or maybe he thought the name was funny enough to keep. And Fort Snelling, where they went next, the weather was cruel. It was in the territory known as Upper Louisiana. Now it's part of Minnesota. And sometimes it got down to 20 below zero. Dr. Emerson bought a wife for Sam, or Dred as everyone was calling him now. And that was a kindly thing to do. Nobody much cared that Fort Snelling was 500 miles above latitude 3630, a line that was supposed to mark the northern limit of slavery in the territories according to something called the Missouri Compromise. And nobody at Fort Snelling could possibly imagine any serious connection between Dr. Emerson's slave and matters of national concern. They came back to St. Louis in the spring, and the Army post at Jefferson Barracks. Dred Scott's first child, a girl, was born on the steamboat Gypsy that brought them home. Later, there would be another girl. But now, Dr. Emerson also took a wife, and 6 years later died, leaving the slaves Dred Scott, Harriet, and 2 infant children in trust to Mrs. Emerson for the benefit of their own baby daughter. Let us be charitable. Emerson's widow might have set Scott and his family free, except for the terms of that trust. But as it was, she couldn't sell them or give them away, nor, as it turned out, could she even rent them out by the hour to earn their own keep. Slave labor, even at 25 cents a day, was coming to be very unpopular in St. Louis. It was a German-Irish immigrant town, and abolitionist feelings were beginning to run high. But the widow Emerson's cash was beginning to run low. And Scott, his wife, and 2 baby daughters became an acute problem in economics. In the end, she solved it by walking away. Widow Emerson and her daughter booked passage east on an Ohio River steamboat and abandoned their legal properties to the cold winds of charity. And that was how it was with Dred Scott, husband, father, and slave, at the beginning of the year 1846.
Great God Almighty, 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 great God Almighty,
Long after poor Dred Scott was dead and buried, after Shiloh, Gettysburg, and Appomattox, there would be an English poet to invent the phrase, the white man's burden. But even in slave-owning Missouri of the 1840s, there was an unwritten code, a sort of ritual of behavior required of white people with relations to black people. That might, if rigidly understood, stand between a man and the shadow of his conscience. Henry Blow, youngest son of old Peter Blow, was the white man. And Sam, his father's one-time slave, now called Dred Scott, was the black man. Scott came to Henry Blow and said, "Help me." And Henry Blow was required to help as a father might be required to help a child. This was the unwritten rule of behavior, correct and understood by both of them. Dred Scott or no Dred Scott, the man had once been Sam Blow, Sam the slave who had come with Henry's father out of the land of the tobacco famine, into Alabama and then Missouri, and the boarding house on Walnut Street. So Henry and his brother Taylor took up the white man's burden, meaning baskets of food, cast-off children's clothing, a roast chicken, and a pint bottle of brandy at Christmas time. And up in Massachusetts was Dred Scott's legal owner, the widow Emerson, who was a northern woman who didn't understand the code, unwritten but required. And it was out of this that the business in the courthouse began. This courtroom. Dred Scott, dutifully following the orders of Henry and Taylor Blow, filed suit against the widow Emerson. He had once been taken, so ran the complaint, to Fort Armstrong in Illinois, where slavery was illegal. And if that was not enough, that was the year at Fort Snelling, where slavery was prohibited by the Missouri Compromise. Mr. Henry said Scott should be free. Not only that, but Harriet and the two children should be free as well. And what all this meant to a middle-aged colored man dying of tuberculosis with absolutely no prospects. That far, Dred Scott was utterly incapable of inquiring. But the lawyers went to work, and the case was argued and lost. Re-argued and won. Then re-argued a third time and lost on appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court. And while all this was going on, the Mexican War was being fought and won. Gold was discovered in California, and vast new territories were added to the nation, stretching all the way from the Red River of Texas to the Pacific. And it suddenly began to dawn on the gentleman in the courthouse that there was now more at stake than the welfare of a simple-minded colored man and his family abandoned on the streets of St. Louis like a basket of new kittens. What would happen in California, Nebraska, or Kansas territories, say, if a slave owner wanted to take his slaves along? Would this automatically make slavery a fact of life everywhere and invalidate the Missouri Compromise? Were the slave laws of Missouri valid on free soil? And if they were, would there ever be such a thing as free soil over even 1 inch of uncommitted territory in the West? These were the issues, and they were big. Too big for poor Dred Scott to understand, even though he felt he was walking in the shadow of giants. And so he trailed after his lawyers, and Mr. Blow walking 5 respectful paces behind, but dimly and growingly aware that he was a somebody. It was somehow mixed up, not just with the dry business of the courts, but with hot contention in the streets and in the new towns. Already there had been incidents along the Kansas border, the beginning of bloody Kansas, and the Jayhawkers, the massacre at Lawrence, and John Brown's living body wrapped in Old Testament fury and marked for delivery along Pottawatomie Creek.
John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. His soul goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
It was 1856. The case was in its 10th year. Through a legal trick, they had gotten it into the federal courts and then pressed it as far as it could go, to the Supreme Court itself. And now, see him walking here, crossing and recrossing the stone floor, trailed a dutiful 5 steps behind his lawyers, as was required by his station, if not by his bursting sense of self-importance. Does he strut a little? Does he look a trifle pompous? Or is there something about him in his new store-bought clothes and stovepipe hat that suggests a minstrel crowd? Poor devil, how could they expect him to understand? He couldn't even write his own name, let alone comprehend the fantastic snarl of legal argument and counter-argument that had made the name, not the man, a flag over the Western world. Could slavery still legally be kept out of the new territories? Could slavery legally be kept south of the latitude 3630 from the west edge of Missouri to the Pacific? That was what the name stood for. And the Supreme Court's decision, when it came, would have to change the critical balance between North and South. Pro-slave or free soil, Union or secession. Dred Scott. The man may have been ridiculous, but there was nothing funny about the name. Soon Queen Victoria, Franz Joseph, Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, and Napoleon III would be discussing its implications in deadly earnest with their ministers. 1856 was an election year, and the issue of Dred Scott was said to be so explosive that Chief Justice Taney held back the decision until the votes were counted and Buchanan was safely in the White House. If you have a taste for irony, here it was, in this room, a colossal joke, a cosmic joke, a joke of really epic bitterness and gall. Dred Scott, a little pompous, a little ridiculous, but still a gentle, simple kind of man. There's no hatred in him, not for the widow Emerson, or for the Chief Justice, or for anybody. He loves them, one and all. But from the commercial hotel across the street comes the drummers and the clerks, the boatmen and the soldiers, and they watch him, self-important and completely ununderstanding as he struts by in his new store-bought clothes and stovepipe hat. And they whisper and snicker words of contempt. But Dred Scott doesn't hear this part. He is basking in what he thinks is admiration and concern and love. And so he raises the ridiculous stovepipe hat and smiles and waves like a king, and then pauses to cough and spit blood into one of the cuspidors of the courthouse. Because quite apart from great and complex national issues, he is undergoing a simple, natural process that ultimately makes brothers of us all. He is dying of tuberculosis. Justice Taney handed down the decision in 1857. Petitioner denied that Dred Scott was a slave, and he always would be a slave, and the Missouri Compromise was dead, and Dudley dead and bloody war would have to follow. And Dred Scott was suddenly left in the dust of receding history. Did he think that it was all about him and Harriet and his children, that it was of the slightest concern to anyone whether he was slave or not? After the decision, they gave him his freedom as kind of a trifling bonus. Henry Blow brought him from the widow Emerson's brother and then turned him loose in a swift, unimportant, anticlimactic gesture that was hardly worth mentioning on the back page of the local newspaper. Across the street from this courthouse was Barnum's Hotel, owned by Theron Barnum, who was a cousin to P.T. the showman. And they gave him his job as porter and shoeshine boy, although he had the cold sweats by now and was coughing blood freely. But Mr. Barnum was kind, according to the ritual, according to the code. There were the baskets of food, cast-off children's clothing, and at last Christmas, a roast chicken and pint bottle of brandy. And anyhow, it was good for business. As long as he was strong enough to move a shoe brush, it was good for business. The clerks and the boatmen and the out-of-town drummers, they could tell their friends, guess who shined my shoes today? It was Dred Scott.